I happened across a copy of the Saginaw News of Monday, April 7th, 1958. Actually, I got it from my good friend Gil Alberg. And big banner headline, some of 47 bodies identified in plane crash, cause sought. And this was a plane crash here in Saginaw, Michigan. Unfortunately, this newspaper is badly mutilated. However, I'm going to read to you what I can of the article, a most horrific event. So it begins. The grim job of identifying the 47 victims of last night's fiery crash of a sleek Capital Airlines New York to Saginaw Viscount continued today at Tri-City Airport. At the same time, Civil Aeronautics Board investigators were attempting to learn what caused the accident. They probed the charred wreckage of the once proud Sky Giant, now only a mass of twisted metal, in a muddy field just 1/2 mile short of the southwest runway, its last target. The accident, first one involving a Capital Viscount since the airline began using the British-made planes almost 4 years ago, is one of Michigan's worst air tragedies. It is the nation's worst civilian tragedy in 1958. The crash of Flight 67 was timed by the Civil Aeronautics Authority's weather station at the airport at 11:19 p.m. The big airliner, loaded with homeward-bound Easter holiday vacationists, businessmen, and some armed service personnel, had stopped at Detroit and Flint, and it was to have continued on to Chicago. There were no survivors. All victims were burned beyond recognition. Identification was being made by teeth, jewelry, or fingerprints if possible to obtain, and clothing. The saddening task was expected to take hours more. By mid-morning, 12 had been positively identified. They are Dr. William Lee of Bay City, Joseph Cara of Flint, James B. Shoup, who had boarded the plane at Columbus, Ohio, Daniel M. Barger of Chattanooga, Tennessee, John McIkins of Chicago, whose brother Ray lives at 305 Swanson, and Lester Walensky of Midland, Dr. Glenn W. Parsons of Montclair, New Jersey, Lieutenant David Donnelly of the U.S. Air Force, home address given as Mount Morris, Mrs. Stanley Russell of Racine, Wisconsin, Captain W.J. Hall, 43, pilot of Westward, New Jersey, First Officer Earl M. Blakely, 27, co-pilot of Levittstown, New York. This is where the article begins to break up, so please bear with me. The Civil Aeronautics Administration said in Detroit any announcement as to the cause of the crash would follow the investigation and would be made either by the CAB or by Capital. Fred Blank of the Civil Aeronautics Board, Chicago's office, is in charge of the investigation. He said it might be a week before the conclusion could be reached as to the cause of the crash. He said preeminently, preliminary investigation, indicated the craft exploded after it hit the ground, and he added, however, that it was entirely too early to get even a possible cause for this disaster. Inspectors said pilot Hull either could have misjudged his approach or the plane could have crashed because of a power or instrument failure. The plane's 4 engines were embedded deep in mud. Powell said Hull appeared to be in direct line with the southwest-northwest runway. He said A.B. Hallman, engine specialist, and Jack Leakey, structural engineer, both with the CAB in Washington, would start tearing down the plane tomorrow. 10 other CAB and CAA investigators were on the scene also. Powell said Hull had made one of his routine radio contacts with the Capitol office at Tri-City Airport just 3 minutes before the crash, and all was well. The plane crashed about 2,300 feet short of the runway. Some passengers waiting to board the doomed Flight 67 at Tri-City drove to Flint to board it because they were told the weather would not permit landing at Tri-City, and the wire services were reporting that. And other waiting at Flint for Flight 959 to Grand Rapids and Milwaukee took Flight 67 to Tri-City because they were told weather at Bishop Airport would force Flight 959 to land at Tri-City instead of at Bishop. The flight from the time it started was an exasperating thing. The plane was rerouted in its takeoff from New York to Newark, New Jersey because of bad weather over LaGuardia Airport, and it left at 7:20 p.m., 1 hour and 20 minutes late. Over Michigan, flight conditions at crash time indicated 900-foot ceiling and an 18-mile northeast wind with a gust of up to 27 miles per hour. Whether the plane exploded in the air or after it hit the ground hasn't been determined. Nelson Garadin of Hemlock, who had taken his family to the Tri-City Airport to see planes land, said he witnessed the crash. He said lights on the plane were barely visible due to the mixture of rain and snow that was whipping across the field, blown by strong northeast wind. He said the plane circled the south end of the field in its landing pattern, and then the plane plunged earthward. There was a blinding flash of orange flame that spurted nearly 100 feet into the air, followed by a muffled explosion, he said. The Capital Airlines in Washington said it had received no information of the explosion. The plane burned fiercely. It is doubtful if anyone could have been saved had he survived the crash or the explosion. The airport terminal was crowded at the time of the tragedy. Flight 458 from Chicago, bound for Flint and Detroit, had landed sometime earlier, and Flight 959, which was scheduled to land at Flint, but landed at Saginaw instead because of weather, had preceded the ill-fated Flight 67 into the airport by only a few minutes. R.H. Waldeck of Kelowna, New Jersey, who had alighted from Flight 959 and had boarded plane 458 for a return flight to Flint, said he was seated in the plane watching the Viscount approach. He said he saw a tongue of flame leap across the plane's wing, followed by a sheet of flame as the explosion occurred, and he was more than a mile from the scene. Elmer Bonhoff of 7320 Garfield Road, who lives about 1 mile east of the crash scene, said he and his wife had retired. He said a light, believed to be the plane's landing lights, flashed into the bedroom. He said this was unusual because if the plane had been on exact course, the light would not have been seen in the bedroom. He said he heard an explosion, not very loud. State police, Saginaw County Sheriff's officers, and police from Saginaw and Midland converged on the scene immediately. Ambulance speeded to the airport from Saginaw, Bay City, and Midland also. The bitter night and the mud hampered rescue workers. Fire trucks and ambulances mired and had to be pulled out by wreckers. Rescue work moved with struggling slowness until Henry Burke, 41, of Freeland, RD1, who lives a few blocks away from the crash scene, arrived with his Caterpillar tractor hauling a farm wagon. The tractor navigated the muddy field, and the pitifully charred bodies of the victims were loaded on the wagon and hauled to a temporary morgue that had been set up in a hangar at the airport. Confusion exists whether the plane exploded in the air or after the crash. John Maroney, senior operations agent at Central Airlines, said the aircraft appeared to be making normal landing when it crashed and then exploded. An unidentified motorist who was seen driving on Garfield Road at the same time told persons at the airport terminal last night that the plane appeared to hit the ground before it burst into flames. Flight 67's 3 crew members who died in the crash were described by Capital Airline officials as the kind of employees we like to hire. Pilot Hull was one of Capital's million milers and was described as an extremely popular captain with his crew. Bickley, a former Air Force jet pilot, joined Capital in October 1956. Miss Denicky was described as an excellent hostess, one of the best we had, by Mrs. Aletha Hanlon, Director of Passenger Services. Police this morning were attempting to keep the scene all but all but those persons who had official business at the airport. It was a next to impossible task. Garfield Road was lined with automobiles filled with curious onlookers. And as dawn broke, relatives and friends of the victims began arriving at the airport. They were asked to add in identification by trying to remember bits of jewelry or some article a person carried or wore. As the bodies were identified, the disposition was left up to the families. The bodies were stretched on a concrete floor and covered with sheets and papers. The bodies were torn and smashed, and most were terribly burned. Meanwhile, normal flight operations at the airport continued. Both flights on the ground last night, when the accident occurred, took off several hours late.